Hi, honeys. Welcome to May, and welcome back to Art That Pisses People Off, Part 2, Colorworks, Bland or Brilliant. I hope you all have caught on to the double entendre of that name. In case you haven't, though, literally, colors can be dull or not, and I hope this episode will not be dull. So, anyways, in this chapter, we will be talking about how color became a focus of exploration throughout modernism, aka the better part of the 20th century. We'll be talking about why these often monochromatic artworks matter in art history and how there's often much more than meets the eye within them. I do apologize for our Friday release instead of a Thursday, but when you hear the rest of this episode, I think you'll be able to forgive me because there was a lot to cover here, actually even more than I expected. And without further ado, let's dive in. Sources for this episode include everything from the Art Story to Encyclopedia Britannica, to the MoMA, to the Guggenheim Foundation, as well as the Tate Modern, and beyond. Going chronologically makes the most sense here, so beginning with the beginning. The term monochromatic originally meant that it could include even different shades of one color, but has since narrowed down to mean just a single shade. It was the next logical step in the early 20th century evolution of modern art away from definite representation, because once the objects, the figures were gone, color and canvas, the material elements of the art, were the things left to play around with. So how did we get to that point of the evolution? Well, the 20th century modernists learned a ton about color, especially the effects of light and dark, from the Impressionists, whose work was centered on managing color in order to indicate light, fog and smog, and other practically invisible or intangible things. Then, in 1882, a group of Parisian artists called the Incoherents tried to prank the Impressionists by introducing them to the very first monochromes, and, in so doing, unknowingly birthing abstraction. One of the first movements to really learn from that incident and run with it was Russian suprematism, arising in the early 20th century, and which emphasized primary colors, geometric shapes, and dynamic lines in order to celebrate the two-dimensionality of the canvas. Rather than trying to trick the eye into thinking that what was represented was 3D, they were instead concerned with showing the shape of the canvas through a color or lack thereof. As Russian suprematism built in influence and grew as a movement, it set the tone for the general beginning theology, one might say, of the monochrome. Now, different institutions word this quote-unquote theology differently, but I think a blend between the MoMA and the Tate definitions works the best. The MoMA says, quote, "Monochrome abstraction, the use of one color over an entire canvas, has been a strategy adopted by many painters wishing to challenge expectations of what an image can and should represent," end quote. The Tate says, quote, "The monochrome often serves one of two purposes. The first of these was communicating spiritual purity. By choosing one color, artists could explore the tranquility of total abstraction. The second purpose of monochrome for some artists was to reduce the painting or sculpture to its simplest form so that the focus of the piece would be on its pure physical elements, color, form, texture, or the way in which it was made," end quote. In the simplest words, the monochrome, especially in the 20th century, is based on the idea of the so-called freedoms that it allows. Freedom in creative techniques, freedom from having to represent anything specific or detailed. There was also the opportunity to address a new challenge in making work that relied on an artist's own understanding of color potency as well as feelings. And a sort of underappreciated, I think, aspect of one of these freedoms is that it allowed artists to explore all the possible shades of a color that can come to mind when one is named. For example, you say red, and different people can think of the shades rose, maraschino cherry, fire truck, maroon, blush, apple, so on. For all of those freedoms and challenges that it presented, the 20th century monochrome was extremely attractive to many, many artists. A key point of this theology is that it forces introspection in the viewer. This is often what people find annoying or disturbing about it because they're confronted with, in a sense, nothingness. They're left to ask the question, why do I see what I either do see or don't see? And left to ask, basically, what do I think is art based on what I think this thing is missing? And that can be a really uncomfortable question for people to ask themselves, especially if they're not very active or very knowledgeable in the arts. Here's one specific example of a monochromatic theology for context, that of Yves Klein. Klein claimed that the sky and its various shades of blue inspired him to continuously attempt to represent the infinite and the immaterial in his artworks, often changing his strategies throughout his career in order to do so. In his case, the works, all in one color, evoke the expansive cohesiveness of the sky and of the sky's blue, or at least it's supposed to. The key part of these artworks is that he removes the concept of form, which he believed would distract from his sky-based goals, even though it was previously a major component of art. As the MoMA says, quote, progressively leaving behind physical objects in favor of impalpable effects and feats of ideation, end quote. The monochrome was the way Klein found was best to do that. So that was the thinking, but in action, it looked a little different. He made his own trademarked ultramarine blue, and Klein often made monochromatic works out of that. With the sky reasoning, this makes some sense. The MoMA explains that for Klein, monochromatic painting was an open door to freedom. It was the way that you could become immersed in the depth of color. And so his drenching the canvas in one solid shade makes sense given what he believed was possible through art and color. Of course, Klein was far from alone in these explorations, so let's talk about some major Western artist contributors to the monochrome, to Colorworks as a genre, I guess you could say. First up, Malevich, one of the earliest notable figures and a founding figurehead of Russian suprematism. Kazimir Malevich was a Russian artist born in 1878. He attended the Stroganov School as well as the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. After a 1912 visit to Paris, he switched pathways or styles from Impressionism, Symbolism, and Fauvism to Russian Cubism, and he taught in Moscow and Petrograd from 1919 till 1921. Malevich died in 1935 near St. Petersburg, unfortunately in poverty and near anonymity because Soviet politicians' disapproval of modern art caused both it and him to fall out of favor. As I mentioned, he was one of the founders of the suprematist movement of abstract painting, but I feel I should clarify here that that is not quite as red flags as it sounds. Britannica describes it as, quote, a term expressing the notion that color, line, and shape should reign supreme over subject matter or narrative in art, end quote. According to the MoMA, the Russian suprematists wanted to distinguish themselves from the much often compared Western Cubists and the like. They say, quote, pledging to be Russia's own art and thus a national style, it asserted a competition with the West and significantly declared a position of difference from Bolshevik internationalism, end quote. But because of this intentional separation from the Bolsheviks, by 1918, the only way to do this and be its own style was through visual metaphors of anarchic creativity, often on paper, because of censorship. However, MoMA cites a text proving that Malevich always intended suprematism to be a blend of formal as well as political concepts, a politically charged artwork by its own nature. So not terribly surprising that he would have run into some difficulties maintaining that in the strict regimes of his nation. Although looking at suprematism deeply gives us a sense of Malevich's values, it's important to look at his individual philosophy as an artist as well here. MoMA points out that Malevich was existing and creating in a post-revolutionary atmosphere, which may have felt like it was grounds for completely starting over, going beyond the cultural and artistic norms of the past in order to become a new generation of avant-gardists. There is some evidence of anarchist foundations or thinking to this part of the philosophy. The suprematists, and especially Malevich, believed that they needed to, quote, defend artists' rights to freedom of expression, which they felt were equally threatened by the pre-revolutionary institutions and the newly established commissariats, end quote. Part of this was their perception that the individual artist had a duty to enact their own revolutions against prior conventions and restrictions in art. In this sense, Malevich and many of his contemporaries were participating in a socially active movement because they were doing the visual equivalent of what was being done in politics and like interpersonal culture, society. An important distinction between Malevich and many other leading Russian avant-gardists, he was not concerned with concepts or even effects of texture, and he got quite a bit of criticism for that. Now, some of Malevich's most famous images involve white squares on white canvas backgrounds or else black squares on white canvas backgrounds. Basically just straight up black and white or white and white geometry. And not knowing about the philosophies and the revolutionary ideology behind it, it's very, very understandable why that sort of image would piss people off. And that's why we're talking about it. But another facet of this interest that can't be left out is that Artland magazine says some of these explorations were based on his fascination with contemporary technology and his changing world, saying, quote, a white square laid atop a background of white, seemingly floating with no tether to our physical reality, Malevich's white on white sought to create the feeling of transcendence which he associated with airplanes and aerial photography, end quote. Among the first to exhibit paintings of abstract geometric elements, he was constantly trying to create intellectual art. He did somewhat get it right. I mean, airplanes really do look like they're just floating little droplets up in the clouds there. So I guess if you have nothing else when you walk up to a Malevich, think of air travel. Another crucial and often institutionally represented 20th century color-focused artist is Agnes Martin. We share a birthday, hers in March of 1912, though she was born in Canada. Martin studied at Columbia and taught at the University of New Mexico, becoming a U.S. citizen in 1950. In 1967, she left New York and traveled the U.S. and Canada until her permanent settling in New Mexico in 1972. Her work had always been influenced by her interests in Zen Buddhism and Taoism, like many of her peers, but for a few years after this move, she incorporates gentle sunset-like color schemes for the first time in decades, putting color back into her artwork. Additionally, post-move, she almost always emphasized the use of stripes to create a sense of composition, and her canvases were almost always 5 or 6 feet square in size. The artist had shows at major institutions across the world, including the Whitney, Dia Beacon, LACMA, Tate, etc., and she passed in 2004. Artland magazine says, quote, "Martin's abstract works inspired by nature are proof of her 1972 claim that anything can be painted without representation," end quote. Her works are known to be somewhat systemic, especially gritty, as in GRIDDY, gritty, not the Philly mascot, for minimalists, but they're intentional. They are meant to create opportunities to reflect on the quiet stability of these very thin, repetitive lines and patterns. The Guggenheim says, quote, "Her commitment to this spare style was informed by her belief in its ability to conjure profound, positive experiences in the viewer," end quote. Britannica notes that in the 1970s, she produced printed equivalents of her paintings, a series of silk screens titled On a Clear Day from 1973. They were designed to mimic her mathematically annotated sketches. And that's one of the things that makes Martin so unique and so important to 20th century art, is that she found a way to create a sense of form in the abstraction through these gridded patterns that were not heavy, that were not overwhelming, but that rather seemed to enhance the color represented on the canvas. She also was a bit unusual in that in her later years, Martin moved into filmmaking and film arts at large as well. Next, a name that's a little more recognizable, Mark Rothko. Born 1903 in what is now Latvia and what was then the SSR, he immigrated to the US at 10. He attended Yale for a couple years, then Parsons School of Design under abstract expressionist influence and painter Arshile Gorky. He briefly worked for the WPA in the easel department, where he met many other Russian Jewish painters and began to show his work in public exhibitions with them. Over the course of the 40s, his art transitioned from biomorphic yet abstract images, pretty obviously influenced by surrealism, to the zones of color over a monochromatic background for which he's famous, and he developed that style in 1947. For the rest of his career, he explored possibilities of these color combinations, the size of the different color fields, and layering techniques. By 1968, he was in very poor health from an aortic aneurysm plus untreated anxiety, as well as heavy drinking and smoking, so he began scaling down at this time, and in 1970, he died by suicide. Something that I didn't actually realize about Rothko, but puts him in league with Van Gogh and other greats, is that he did not see much positive attention or success, especially outside the US, within his own lifetime, but is now all but a household name. Of Rothko's legacy, the art story says, quote, "To stand in front of a Rothko is to be in the presence of the sublime spirituality he relentlessly sought to evoke. Rigidly uncompromising, Rothko refused to bend to the more distasteful aspects of the art world, a position upheld by his children who did nothing less than alter the entire state of the art market in their fierce protection of his life and work," end quote. So let's talk about his own personal philosophy of art and the monochrome. He was very big into mythology and philosophy and insisted that these were incorporated into his works. For him, the rectangles were a way to represent presences that could not be represented through the human or any other figure. The U.S. National Gallery of Art says, quote, "In these works, large scale, open structure, and thin layers of color combine to convey the impression of a shallow pictorial space," end quote. The MoMA notes that for Rothko, art making was a moral act and a means of deep communication as well as connection. For this reason, as was hinted at, he often made controversial decisions. For example, his refusal of a Guggenheim Foundation award because of his belief that art should not be competitive. Another time, he refused a 1953 offer by the Whitney to purchase 2 of his works because he wanted them in the world in a different way. And he also ditched out on a 1958 Seagram Building mural contract because he developed fears about his personal artistic integrity in the face of such high glamour and wealth. Art Story sums up this controversial decision-making by saying, quote, "Rothko maintained the social revolutionary ideas of his youth throughout his life. In particular, he supported artists' total freedom of expression, which he felt was compromised by the market. This belief often put him at odds with the art world establishment, leading him to publicly respond to critics and occasionally refuse commissions, sales, and exhibitions," end quote, as we just talked about a couple examples of them. Rothko ultimately wanted to bring his viewers to very powerful emotion through the effects of the color combinations, the balance, and the combined elements of his paintings, saying, quote, "I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and the fact that a lot of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I can communicate those basic human emotions. If you are moved only by their color relationships, then you miss the point," end quote. Whereas artists of the Renaissance, the Reformation, several other R periods in art history were focused on demonstrating the sublime through representations of biblical scenes or religious raptures. Rothko was instead attempting to show the sublime through demonstrating presences in the artwork. Presences which, especially when combined, could draw out those deep experiences. And finally, Barnett Newman. Shout out Iron Man 2, because hell yeah, I am also that kind of nerd. Born in 1905 and raised in New York City, he graduated the New York City Community College system in 1927 in philosophy. He then spent some time running his family clothing manufacturing business and attempting to break into politics. The National Gallery of Art describes him as an intellectual concerned with painting, sculpture, and writing, and that's relevant because he actually breaks into the visual art scene by contributing to catalogs and other written materials, especially for early and hugely impactful groups like the American Modern Artists. In the spring of 1945, he drafted his monologue essay manifesto, The Plastic Image. He asserted that between the time of the Impressionists and the 1940s, modernist painters had solved the technical problems of the language of painting, color, shape, atmosphere, and should go on to transcend such decorative aspects of the art to project concepts. So that explains a good amount of his philosophy as well as the greater philosophy behind the monochrome and color works of the 20th century right there. Newman, unfortunately, was not very successful with either the critics or the American public for most of his life, pretty much until the 60s, though he was popular with peers such as Pollock and Rothko. He is now very highly regarded as a pioneer and figurehead of abstract expressionism, as well as an inspiration for the following generation of modernists. According to the Barnett Newman Foundation, he was also very politically and culturally active throughout his life. He was the son of Jewish immigrants and took up many causes related to both his heritage as well as modernism as a movement over the years. The MoMA cites examples of him participating in artist protests in 1943 as well as 1950, and later in 1967, quote, Newman signs an open letter in the New York Review of Books in protest of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and finally in 1968, to protest the actions of the Chicago Police Department under Mayor Richard Daley, he removed a sculpture from the exhibition Dada Surrealism and Their Heritage at the AIC. Sorry, that's Art Institute of Chicago. Newman died July 4th, 1970, of a heart attack. Shifting over to his actual artworks, beginning in the mid-40s, he began to seek his so-called mystical art style and first began to make his famous so-called zips, his signature vertical lines of color which divide an otherwise monochromatic canvas. Says the Tate, quote, his paintings explore the sense of place that viewers experience with art and incorporate simplistic forms to emphasize this feeling, end quote. The Barnett Newman Foundation agrees, stating that Newman asserted at the First International Congress on Religion, Architecture, and the Visual Arts in New York, quote, what matters to a true artist is that he distinguish between a place and no place at all. And the greater the work of art, the greater will be this feeling. And this feeling is the fundamental spiritual dimension, end quote. So, as we stated in the beginning, and as going through these various artists' philosophies has showed us, a lot of them went through this monochromatic 20th century modernism thing because they were looking for a technical challenge. They were looking to explore everything that could possibly be done by only using colored paint. They were looking to build philosophies based on not necessarily minimalism with a capital M, but minimalist ideas in the sense of trying to do the most with the least. There is actually quite a bit of meaning behind these really boring kind of looking 20th century modern color works. And I hope I have shown you enough proof that they are brilliant. Now, honeys, I was fully intending to trace most of the stages of the monochromes throughout the 20th century, but then I came across a wonderful little surprise that had me instead going for the sampling approach that we just did. And that wonderful surprise was the discovery, at least for me, of the Korean monochrome movement, Dansekwa. Dansekwa was a loosely bound movement grounded in post-war struggles over Korean national identity, belonging, and traditions. Says curator Joan Key in Freeze, quote, what all these very different artists had in common was a commitment to thinking more intensively about the constituent elements of mark, line, frame, surface, and space around which they understood the medium of painting, end quote. Dansekwa artists started making their impact upon the Korean scene in the 1970s, though they were working before that. Many of the leading group were seen as practicing existing dominant forms of art from the late 50s, which shifted in the mid-60s when the ideology behind these art forms became disorganized, and yet, at that same time, its recognizable style emerged. The kind of group began exhibiting publicly in 1973, while South Korea was under martial law and the country's social system was just a big question mark. This context is notable because social as well as artistic norms and hierarchies relaxed at the time, which allowed artists to experiment with previously lowbrow sculpture, abstract painting, and more. This is especially true because their government salons, called kukjans, had lost much of their power by then. So these artists were dealing with not only identity, but an unprecedented amount of freedom to explore what that meant through their art. The fact that the group was loosely bound means that they all had pretty distinct styles, but as a movement, specific characteristics and impacts at that time have become visible with, hindsight. Typically, these artists emphasized repetitive patterns, the physicality of their materials through the visible gestures they left on the canvas, as well as having their focus on the artistic process, not on achieving an end result, but the act of physical interaction with a canvas. In this process, the gesture focus and abstraction, the material focus, they rejected realism, as in the movement known for painting everyday people in everyday situations, as well as formalism, aka making things look like their shapes in real life. They only painted in monochrome and drew tons of attention to the flatness of canvas. According to Artspur magazine, quote, "The modern and anti-structural dimension of Donsekwa is opposed to the more classical style of painting that was then most valued in East Asia. Abstract painters began to experiment more, tearing the material, dipping the canvas, repeating their strokes. At the time, this artistic practice allowed them to escape political authority and restrictions," end quote. Another element of Donsekwa that was different from past Korean art is that it was viewer activated, in the sense that these works were not considered complete by their artists without a viewer gaze. This played on the subject-object relationships by making both dependent on each other in a way that we did not see in the Western monochromatic or abstract movement. Donsekwa had multiple purposes and philosophies that aligned, and that is really what bound these artists together more than any official claims to unity. One such main shared philosophy was the attempt to remove regional influences from their aesthetic style to create a universal one that could be claimed by literally anyone. This was especially important as some Donsekwa artists used their work to try and bridge the gap between the expectations surrounding Korean artists at that time and their own aspirations. The movement was also responding to its political context. At the time, the CIA's International Cooperation Administration was kind of waging Cold War in the arts as well. As social realism grew in many communist countries, for example, Soviet Russia and North Korea, the US and its aligned nations pedestaled, supported, promoted abstract expressionism. Donsekwa much more aligned with the latter, so of course the US was on board with it. But that situation was complicated by the Vietnam context as well. The US had made a deal, troops for funds, with the South Korean president, Park Chung-hee, who expected these artists to create promotional images to support his political moves. But these artists were not content to solely produce propaganda, and abstraction was a way for them to essentially get around that by eliminating any figures in their works whatsoever. There's also the urban and industrial growth context to consider. As the Art Institute of Chicago points out, many avant-garde artists were reacting to this transformation of their nation towards standardization and efficiency, and looked to the influence of abstract Western art to kind of combine their monochromatic palettes with repetitive lines and grids to, quote, eliminate personal interpretations of the world, end quote. As exciting as it was to learn all of this about this movement, maybe the most fascinating thing is that it lives on much more than any of the Western 20th century abstract movements did. Fries says, quote, by the mid-1970s, Donsekwa had become a dominant force in Korea and was prominently promoted in Japan through exhibitions such as Korea Facets of Contemporary Art, held at the Tokyo Central Museum of Art in 1977, as well as some other exhibition series in the Korean capital. It continues to be an inspiration for artists working in monochromatic or abstract styles today. A curator of an upcoming exhibit of Donsekwa art, Yoonjin Sup, also is quoted in Fries as saying, "It is because of this ongoing vitality that I believe it is necessary to explore the historical differences between the relatively short-lived period of minimalist vocabularies in the West and the very different painting experiments happening in Korea at the same time. Donsekwa's formal vocabularies of austerity and simplicity shouldn't be viewed as mere curiosities," end quote. And I agree. I wish I had learned about this movement much, much sooner because it provides a really interesting counter-narrative to a lot of the Western stuff that I had pretty much drilled into my head. In any case, it should be noted that across the world in the 20th century, artists were completely fascinated with these experiments, with the ability to focus solely on color and canvas and create a myriad of effects, questions, both technical and spiritual, out of objectively pretty formally simple artworks. I'm very happy to be able to present you with this complete narrative as I personally now have learned it. All right, honeys, I've got one last story for you, a promised little extra bit from our first chapter in this series where it didn't really fit that well. I promised to tell you guys how Kapoor can be an ass sometimes, aka the Vantablack story. And here it is. This story began with his successful experimentation back in 2014 to get the blackest material in the universe. He achieved one, getting a material paint that can absorb 99.8% of all light. However, he made sure that only he could use it. He signed exclusive rights to it with the inventing UK firm Seri Nanosystems, who developed it with military purposes in mind. In fairness, though, Kapoor had been trying for many years to achieve similar effects through canvas, cutting, and other methods. This move, though, the exclusive licensing, kicks off debates over who owns the right to what art supplies, as well as a deliciously petty color developmental process that banned Kapoor from some of its results. Taking a bit of a closer look at that situation, the outrage on his licensing was centered on the idea of it being a monopolizing move, although precedents do exist. As we even covered in this episode, Yves Klein patented his International Klein Blue in the 1960s for his monochromatic painting series. Precedents also exist in a broader sense. Some materials have been exclusive in a sense throughout history for reasons such as cost, rarity of pigment sources, sources available due to trade, and so on. The collector says, quote, "The recipe for mummy brown paint includes actual ground-up mummies and has not been produced since the early 20th century, in part because of the dwindling supply of mummies," end quote. So, not necessarily unprecedented, but Vantablack was a bit of a different case because of its scientific possibility and achievement as well. As the collector puts it, quote, "The controversy exploded so dramatically, at least in part, because of this essential allure surrounding diverse materials so dark it shrouds form, end quote. But that's really what makes Vantablack so special, is it literally looks as though a black hole has been photoshopped in real life. You cannot see any of the details of an object, no matter how complex, painted in Vantablack. So a lot of the responses, particularly those of Stuart Semple, have hinged on the creation of the most of a color that things can be. For example, the pinkest pink and the glitteriest glitter, which Semple makes available for anyone but Kapoor to use. And he really means it when he says that. Art News reports that the legal rider for the sale of either the pinkest pink or the glitteriest glitter says, quote, "By adding this product to your cart, you confirm that you are not Anish Kapoor, that you are in no way affiliated to Anish Kapoor. You are not purchasing this item on behalf of Anish Kapoor or an associate of Anish Kapoor. To the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, this paint will not make its way into the hands of Anish Kapoor." Semple himself expected this to mostly be an instance of performance art, but nevertheless, he sold thousands of units of both of those colors. Other individuals upset by being banned from Vantablack have set out to make an even blacker black as well. Says Art News, quote, "Artist Dima Strib actually created a blacker 99.995% absorbent black with MIT scientists in 2019, end quote. That even blacker black was unveiled in an installation at the New York Stock Exchange entitled The Redemption of Vanity. Many of Kapoor's personal comebacks and defenses for his licensing of Vantablack center on its limited quantity, the producing company's hopes for its military use, and its very delicate making process. He remains tight-lipped on the development processes of Vantablack and whether he will relinquish his stranglehold on it even to this day. Okay, honeys, that is officially all I have for you on Colorworks. I hope that you have learned to appreciate a little bit more the monochrome, why the 20th century artists, the modernists, were all about it all over the world, and can begin to appreciate the blackest black, pinkest pink, bluest blue, and other blankest blanks that you see in the art world. I'll catch you all Tuesday for a new edition of The Business, and in the meantime, have a great weekend. Enjoy the start of your May, and feel free to check out our new Patreon as well as our Ko-fi if you feel like supporting me in making this show possible. Thank you in advance for your support. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.